My brothers mocked my inheritance until they dug up my father's secret. Chapter 1. The lawyer read my father's will out loud, and when he got to my name, my oldest brother laughed so hard he had to put down his coffee. A farm, Richard said, wiping his eyes like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Dad left the school teacher a dead farm and left us the company. That sounds about right. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry either. I just sat there in that cold office with the smell of old paper and furniture polish, and I nodded because there was nothing else to do. My father was 3 days in the ground, and his 2 favorite sons were already dividing up the spoils like vultures who'd been circling for years and finally got their turn at the body. Nobody in that room knew that the dead farm they were mocking me for would end up being worth more than every business my father ever built combined. Nobody knew that in 6 weeks, I would be standing in a muddy field at 2 a.m. with a shovel in my hands and my heart pounding out of my chest, staring down into a hole that would change everything my family thought they knew about who we were. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really started. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 39 years old. I teach high school science in a small town 2 hours outside of Columbus, Ohio. And until the day my father died, I thought I understood my own life pretty well. I thought I knew where I stood in my family. I'd made peace with it a long time ago, or at least I told myself I had. My father, Walter Carter, was a self-made man. He grew up poor, the kind of poor where you wear your brother's shoes until your toes bleed through the front of them. And he built 2 companies from nothing, a construction firm and a real estate development company that by the time I was in college owned half the commercial property in 3 counties. He was a hard man, not cruel, not exactly, but hard the way a man gets when he spent his whole life clawing his way up and never quite trusts that the ground under him is solid. He had 3 sons. Richard was the oldest, 43 when Dad died, sharp-suited and sharper-tongued, running the construction side of the business like he'd been born holding a hard hat. Daniel was the middle son, 41, running the real estate arm, always smiling, always charming, always one bad investment away from disaster, though none of us like to say that out loud. And then there was me, the youngest, the one who went to college for biology instead of business, the one who became a teacher instead of an executive, the one who my father used to look at across the dinner table with an expression I could never quite name. Not disappointment, not pride, something in between, something that looked almost like he was studying me. My mother died when I was 12. Cancer, fast and merciless, gone in 4 months. After that, my father changed. He threw himself into work, and my brothers threw themselves into becoming exactly what he needed them to be. Hungry, ambitious, ruthless, when the moment called for it. I didn't do that. I couldn't. I spent my afternoons in the woods behind our house instead of in boardrooms, and somewhere along the way, my father and I drifted into 2 different orbits that happened to share a last name. We weren't estranged. I want to be clear about that. He came to my wedding. He called on my birthday. He showed up twice a year at my classroom door unannounced, just to watch me teach for 10 minutes before he had to catch a flight somewhere. But we weren't close. Not the way he was close with Richard and Daniel, who worked beside him every single day. So when he died, a heart attack, sudden, alone in his study at 11 o'clock at night, I grieved him the way you grieve someone you loved but never quite finished understanding. And 2 weeks later, sitting in that lawyer's office, I found out that in his will, he'd done something that made absolutely no sense to anyone in the room except apparently to him. Richard got full ownership of Carter Construction, Daniel got full ownership of Carter Real Estate Group, and me, the son who'd spent his life avoiding the family business entirely, I got 240 acres of abandoned farmland in a town called Millbrook Hollow that none of us had lived near in over 30 years. 240 acres of dirt, Richard said again, shaking his head, still grinning. Dad really did love you best, huh, Mikey? Don't, Daniel said, but he was smiling too, trying not to. I looked at the lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Harold Alderman who had worked for my father for almost 20 years. He wasn't smiling. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, the same kind of expression my father used to wear. Is that everything? I asked him. The farm and nothing else? There's a letter, Mr. Alderman said. Your father left a letter, to be given to you specifically, and only you. Once the will was formally read, he was very clear about the timing. Richard's smile faltered just slightly. A letter? He didn't leave us a letter. He left instructions for each of you, Mr. Alderman said carefully. Yours were financial. Michael's was personal. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting, and something about seeing that handwriting. After not seeing it in months, after knowing I'd never see it fresh again, hit me harder than the funeral had, I didn't open it there. I couldn't. Not with Richard's eyes on me. Not with that smirk still hanging around the edges of his mouth, like he was waiting for something else to laugh at. I folded the envelope, put it in my jacket pocket, and I said the only thing I could think to say. Thank you, I told Mr. Alderman, and then I left. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I opened it. My hands were shaking, which surprised me, because I hadn't cried at the funeral, not really, and I thought, maybe I was one of those people who processes grief slow and quiet, the way a lake freezes from the edges in toward the middle. The letter was short, 4 paragraphs, in his careful, blocky handwriting. Michael, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your brothers are probably laughing about the farm. Let them laugh. I need you to go to Millbrook Hollow before you decide what to do with the land. Don't sell it. Don't sign anything. Just go and walk the property and talk to a man named Otis Greer if he's still there. He'll know what to show you. I know this doesn't make sense right now. I know it looks like I left you with nothing while your brothers got everything. But I promise you, son, I thought about this decision for 30 years. And I never once doubted it was the right one. You were always the one I trusted to do right by that land and by the people it belongs to. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. I loved you more than I ever knew how to say. Go to the farm, Michael. Everything I couldn't tell you is there. Dad. I read it 4 times in that parking lot. And then I started the car and drove home, and I didn't tell my brothers a single word about what was in it. Millbrook Hollow was a 2.5-hour drive from my house, out past the last stretch of highway, where the cell service starts to flicker and the GPS starts second-guessing itself. I went the following Saturday alone, telling my wife Rachel I just needed to see the place before I figured out what to do with it. Rachel is the kind of person who trusts my instincts even when I don't trust them myself. She kissed me goodbye that morning and said, "Call me when you get there," and didn't ask any more questions, even though I know she had them. The town itself was smaller than I expected. A single main street, a diner, a hardware store, a church with white paint peeling off the steeple. I stopped at the diner for coffee and asked the waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag that said Dottie, if she knew where the old Carter property was. Her whole face changed when I said the name. "You're Walter's boy," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, Michael." She studied me for a long moment, the way people in small towns study strangers who might not be strangers at all. Your daddy used to come through here every few months. Never said much. Always asked about the Greer place out past the old mill road. She paused. Sorry for your loss, sweetheart. Whole town felt for your family when we heard. Thank you, I said, surprised. Did you know him well? Nobody knew Walter Carter well, she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it. But he did right by this town in his way, more than most people realize. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but a customer called her away before I could, and I finished my coffee with more questions than I'd walked in with. The farm was 4 miles outside of town, down a gravel road that hadn't seen a grader in years, judging by the ruts. When I finally saw it through the windshield, something in my chest tightened in a way I didn't expect. It was beautiful in a sad, forgotten way. 240 acres of rolling fields gone wild with tall grass, a farmhouse with a sagging porch and boarded windows, a big red barn leaning slightly to one side, like an old man favoring a bad hip. And beyond it all, a tree line that faded into soft blue hills in the distance. I parked at the end of the drive and just sat there for a minute, looking at it. It didn't look like a joke. It didn't look like the punchline my brothers had made it into back in that lawyer's office. It looked like a place that had been loved once, a long time ago, and then left alone to hold its breath and wait. I got out of the car, and that's when I saw the old man sitting on the porch steps, like he'd been waiting for me. He was maybe 75, 78, with a face weathered brown and deep from decades outdoors, wearing a flannel shirt despite the warm weather and a cap that had faded from whatever color it used to be. He stood up slow when he saw me, using the porch rail for balance, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. You've got his eyes, he said. Excuse me? Walter's eyes. Same color, same way of squinting at things like you're trying to see through them. He came down the steps carefully. You'd be Michael. My heart started beating faster. You know who I am? Your daddy talked about you, the old man said. More than you'd think. I'm Otis Greer. I worked this land for your father for going on 35 years. Otis Greer. The name from the letter. I felt something settle into place inside my chest. A small click, like the first piece of a puzzle finding its edge. He wrote you a letter, didn't he? Otis said, not really asking. Told you to come find me. How did you know that? Otis smiled, and it was a tired, sad kind of smile. Because he told me 3 months before he died that if anything happened to him, his youngest boy would come. He said you'd be the one. He looked out over the fields, and his voice got quieter. He said the other two would never bother to come at all. Guess he wasn't wrong about that either. We stood there for a moment, two strangers who weren't really strangers, connected by a dead man's careful planning. Mr. Greer, I said, what is this place? Why did my father leave it to me instead of selling it, instead of developing it like everything else he owned? Otis looked at me for a long time before he answered. Come inside, he said. There's things I can show you and things I can't. But I promised your daddy I'd start you off right, so let's start. The inside of the farmhouse was dustier than I expected, but not as ruined as the outside suggested. Someone had been keeping the roof patched, keeping the pipes from freezing in winter, keeping the place from collapsing entirely into itself. Otis, I realized. Otis had been doing it for years, quietly on my father's payroll, for a property none of us even knew we had. Your father bought this land in 1987, Otis said, sitting me down at an old kitchen table while he made coffee on a propane stove like it was the most natural thing in the world. Before Carter construction, before any of it. Back when he was still just a young man with more debt than sense. I didn't know that, I said. I thought he built the company first and bought property later. That's what he wanted people to think. Otis poured 2 mugs of coffee, black, no sugar, and set one in front of me. Truth is, this farm is where it all started. Everything your daddy built, the construction company, the real estate business, every building with the Carter name on it downtown, it all traces back to something he found on this land, back before you were even born. My hands went still around the mug. Found what? Otis looked at me for a long moment, weighing something. I made your father a promise a long time ago that I wouldn't be the one to tell that part. He wanted you to find it yourself when the time came. Said it was important that you understood it the way he understood it, piece by piece, not all at once. He took a sip of his coffee. But I can tell you where to start looking. Where? The old well house out past the north field. He pointed through the kitchen window toward a small stone structure I hadn't even noticed on the drive in, half swallowed by ivy. And the barn. Your father spent more nights in that barn than he ever spent in this house, especially in the early years. There's a floor safe under the workbench. Combination's your mother's birthday. The day, the month, the year, in that order. I felt a chill run down my arms, despite the warm coffee in my hands. You've known this whole time, all these years, working out here, keeping this place alive, and you never told anyone? Your daddy paid me well to keep quiet, Otis said, not unkindly. But it wasn't really about the money. Walter Carter saved my life once, a long time before any of this land business. I owed him my silence, and I gave it gladly. He looked out the window toward the barn. But I'll tell you something else, Michael, and I want you to hear it clear. Your father wasn't a perfect man. He made choices out here that I didn't always agree with. But everything he did because he was scared of what would happen if the wrong people found out what's under this ground. Under the ground, I repeated slowly. Otis, is there something buried out here? Otis stood up, carrying his coffee mug to the sink, his back to me. Go look in the barn, son. I think it's past time you knew. The barn smelled like old hay and motor oil and decades of dust. Otis walked me out there himself, using a flashlight, even though there was still daylight outside, because the windows had been boarded over from the inside, which struck me as strange the moment I noticed it. Why would you board over the windows of an empty barn from the inside? Your father didn't want anyone looking in, Otis said, like he'd read my mind. Not even by accident. Not even a hunter walking the tree line with a pair of binoculars. The workbench sat against the back wall, covered in a tarp gray with dust. Otis pulled it back, and underneath was exactly what he'd described. A heavy steel floor safe, set into a reinforced section of the barn floor, the kind of safe that looked like it belonged in a bank vault, not a farm building in the middle of nowhere. My hands were shaking again as I knelt down in front of it. Otis recited the combination low and slow, and I turned the dial with fingers that didn't feel entirely like my own. The safe clicked open. Inside, there were 3 things. A thick manila folder, yellowed with age. A smaller sealed envelope with my name on it. The handwriting matching the letter I'd already read. And a small velvet pouch that, when I opened it, spilled a handful of raw, unpolished stones into my palm. Dark, dense, almost metallic looking, unlike anything I'd ever seen in a jewelry store or a science textbook. What are these? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Otis looked down at the stones in my hand, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something like fear cross his face. That, he said quietly, is why your father spent 30 years making sure nobody ever found this place. I opened the second envelope first because my hands were already shaking and I needed my father's voice, more than I needed answers right at that moment. Michael, if you're standing in that barn, then Otis has done exactly what I asked him to do. And you've found the safe. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you any of this while I was alive. I told myself for years that I was protecting you by keeping you out of it, and maybe that's true. But if I'm honest with myself, I think I was also protecting myself. Some secrets get heavier the longer you carry them, and this one nearly broke me more than once. In 1987, before I had a dollar to my name, I was surveying this land for a farming co-op, trying to make ends meet doing soil work. I found something in the ground on the north end of the property that a geologist friend of mine, a man I trusted completely, identified as a rare mineral deposit. I won't pretend I understood the science of it back then, and I want you to read the report in the folder, because you're the scientist in this family, not me. But I understood the value of it. Even in 1987, a deposit like this was worth more money than I could wrap my head around. I had a choice to make, Michael. I could have sold the mineral rights to the first company that came sniffing, taken a fortune, and lived comfortable for the rest of my life. Companies did come sniffing more than once over the years, and some of them didn't take no for an answer easily. But I saw what happened to towns like this one when big corporations came in and stripped the land bare for profit. I saw what it did to the water, to the people, to the soil that farmers like the Greers had worked for generations. I couldn't do that to Millbrook Hollow. I couldn't do it to Otis, who by then had become more of a brother to me than a hired hand. So instead, I did something slower. I quietly extracted small amounts over the years, through channels I controlled carefully, and used the money to build the businesses I gave to your brothers. I built an empire on top of a secret, and I told myself that someday, when the time was right, I would find a way to make it right. Not by exploiting what's under this ground, but by making sure it never fell into the wrong hands, and that whatever came of it would benefit the people who deserved it most. I chose you to inherit this land because you are the only one of my sons who has never once asked me for money, never once looked at a thing and calculated what it was worth before deciding whether to love it. Your brothers are good men in their own way, Michael, but they were raised inside the business, and the business teaches you to see value before you see anything else. You were raised outside of it, and you learn to see people and land and truth before you learn to see dollar signs. There is enough here to change your life and to change this town's life, if it's handled the right way. There's also enough here to destroy everything if it falls into the wrong hands. I have made enemies protecting this secret, Michael. There is a man named Vance Sterling who has spent almost 15 years trying to find out what I found on this land. If he or his people ever come near you, asking questions about the farm, be careful. Trust no offer that comes too easily. Read the report, talk to Otis, take your time. And when you're ready, decide what kind of man you want to be with what I've left you. I love you, son. I always did. Even when I didn't know how to show it. Dad. I sat down hard on an overturned bucket, the letter trembling in my hands, and Otis stood quietly beside me, letting the silence stretch out as long as it needed to. A mineral deposit, I finally said. What kind? Otis handed me the manila folder. The geologist called it a lithium-bearing pegmatite formation, said it was one of the richest deposits east of the Mississippi. That was back in the 80s, mind you, but with everything the world wants lithium for these days, batteries, electric cars, all of it, Michael, I think it might be worth more now than it ever was back then. I opened the folder with hands that felt disconnected from my body, and inside were pages of geological survey data, hand-drawn maps of the property with sections circled and labeled, correspondence between my father and the original geologist, all of it dated across more than 3 decades, showing a careful, obsessive private history that none of us, not me, not Richard, not Daniel, had ever known existed. 240 acres, I said slowly. And Richard and Daniel think I got the bad end of the deal. They don't know, Otis said. And your daddy wanted it that way. At least until you had a chance to understand it yourself and decide what to do. I looked up at him. But someone else might know. This Vance Sterling my father mentioned. Otis's jaw tightened. Sterling's been sniffing around this county for years. Used to come out here personally, back when your father was alive. Real polite, real friendly. Always asking to buy the land for conservation purposes, he'd say. Your father always ran him off. He paused. Haven't seen him since the funeral, but I'd bet good money he's heard your daddy passed, and he's already circling. That night, I stayed at the farmhouse instead of driving home. I called Rachel and told her some of it. Not all of it. I wasn't ready to say the word lithium out loud yet, like saying it might make it disappear, but enough that she understood I needed a few more days out there before I came home. Be careful, she said. And there was something in her voice that told me she could hear, even through the phone, that something had shifted in me since that morning. I will, I promised. I didn't sleep much. I sat at that kitchen table until almost 2 a.m, reading through the geological report page by page, cross-referencing what I remembered from college chemistry, trying to understand the scale of what my father had been sitting on my entire life. By the time I finally went to bed in one of the dusty upstairs rooms, I understood 2 things clearly. The first was that my father hadn't just left me a farm. He'd left me the answer to a question none of us had ever known to ask. The real reason Carter Construction and Carter Real Estate existed at all. The hidden root system underneath the tree my brothers had spent their whole lives climbing. The second was that I had no idea what to do next. And that scared me more than anything else in that folder. I woke up the next morning to the sound of tires on gravel. And when I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. A silver SUV was pulling up the drive. And even from a distance, I recognized the confident, unhurried way the driver parked. Like he owned every piece of ground he ever stood on. Richard. He got out of the car in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, and behind him, a second car pulled in. Daniel, driving his own truck, looking a little less comfortable, a little more like a man being dragged somewhere he didn't fully want to go. I met them on the porch, my heart hammering, trying to keep my face as unreadable as I possibly could. Well, look at this place, Richard said, walking up the steps like he was inspecting a property for demolition. Didn't think you'd actually come out here, Mikey. Figured you'd just let the county take it for back taxes. What are you 2 doing here? I asked. Can't a couple of brothers check in on their kid brother's new farm? Daniel said. But there was something off in his voice, something apologetic underneath the joke. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. Look, I'll be straight with you. Daniel and I talked, and we think it's ridiculous that you got stuck with this place while we got the real assets. So we've got an offer for you. My whole body went still. An offer. We'll buy it from you, Richard said. Both of us splitting it 50-50. $200,000 cash today, and you never have to think about this dump again. You can put it toward your mortgage, your retirement, whatever you want. It's more than fair considering the place is basically worthless. $200,000 for land that, if my father's letter in that folder were even half true, might be worth more than every asset my brothers had inherited combined. I studied Richard's face carefully, looking for a crack, for some sign that he already knew what I knew, that this offer was less generosity and more theft dressed up in a suit. But all I saw was the same confident impatience Richard always wore, the look of a man who assumed he already understood every situation he walked into. "Why the rush?" I asked carefully. "Dad's only been gone a few weeks. Why does this need to happen today?" Something flickered across Richard's face. Small, fast, almost nothing, but I caught it. "No rush," he said too quickly. "Just being practical. This place is a liability, Michael. Property taxes, upkeep, liability insurance if some hunter trespasses and breaks his leg. You're a teacher. You don't need this headache." "I appreciate the concern," I said slowly, "but I think I want to hold on to it for now. See what it's like to own some land." Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, the same flicker I'd seen a moment before. "Michael, be reasonable. This isn't some sentimental keepsake. It's 240 acres of dead farmland in the middle of nowhere. Take the money." I said, "No, Richard." The porch went quiet. Daniel shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking between us like a kid caught between two arguing parents. "Fine," Richard finally said, his voice tightening into something colder. "Your call. But don't come crying to us in 6 months when the taxes eat you alive and this place is still worthless." He turned and walked back toward his car, then stopped and turned back around. And for just a second, something almost desperate crossed his face. "Seriously, Michael, think about it. There's no reason to be stubborn about this." They left 20 minutes later, and I stood on that porch, watching the dust settle behind their cars, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Otis came around the side of the house once they were gone, having stayed out of sight the whole time. $200,000, I told him, for land my father's letter says is worth a lot more than that. Otis nodded slowly. "That's a strange number, isn't it? Not insulting enough to make you suspicious right away? Just low enough that a man in a hurry might not think twice?" "You think Richard knows something?" "I think," Otis said carefully, "that your brother didn't drive 2.5 hours out here on a Sunday morning just to be neighborly. That afternoon, while walking the tree line near the north field, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. A torn scrap of paper caught in the brush near an old survey stake, the kind of stake a land surveyor uses. The paper was recent, not weathered, not faded, clean edges where it had been ripped from something larger. On it, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 2 words and a fraction of a number. Deposit confirmed. And beneath it, Charibo Ipor Forstwin, Sterling Resources, Lot 14, B. Someone had been out here recently, someone who wasn't me and wasn't Otis and knew exactly what they were looking for. I called Mr. Alderman, my father's lawyer, that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the folder spread out in front of me and the torn scrap of paper next to it like evidence at a crime scene, because that's exactly what it felt like it was becoming. "Mr. Alderman, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, Michael." His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had known this call was coming, in one form or another, since the day he handed me that envelope. "Did my father ever mention a company called Sterling Resources, or a man named Vance Sterling?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that I knew the answer before he said a word. "Your father had me draft 2 cease and desist letters against Sterling Resources over the past 10 years, Mr. Alderman finally said. "Vance Sterling has approached your father directly on at least 4 occasions that I'm aware of. Always about the Millbrook Hollow property, always about buying mineral rights. Your father always refused, sometimes politely, and toward the end, not so politely." My stomach twisted. "Did Richard or Daniel know about this?" Another pause, longer this time. "Michael, I have to be careful about what I say here, because of attorney-client privilege that extended to your father, but I can tell you this much. About 8 months before your father passed, Richard came to my office without your father's knowledge and asked me a series of questions about the Millbrook Hollow property, ownership structure, mineral rights. What would happen to the land in the event of your father's death? The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. You're telling me Richard already knew there was something valuable out here, before Dad even died? I'm telling you that Richard asked questions that suggested he suspected something, Mr. Alderman said carefully. I don't know what he knows now, or how he came to suspect it. But Michael, your father was very deliberate about keeping this compartmentalized. The will was structured the way it was structured for a reason. I believe your father knew or feared that at least one of your brothers might try to interfere if they understood the full picture too early. I sat there for a long time after I hung up the phone, staring at the torn scrap of paper on the table, at the words Sterling Resources circled in my mind like a warning label. My father had spent 30 years protecting a secret from the entire world, and in his final act, he'd handed that secret to me, the one son he trusted to carry it. But he hadn't counted on his other two sons already circling closer than he realized. And he hadn't counted on running out of time before he could finish protecting me the way he'd protected the land. Otis found me on the porch the next morning, sitting with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, watching the sun come up over the north field where, somewhere beneath the grass, my father's entire life's secret was buried. You didn't sleep, he said. It wasn't a question. Richard knew, I told him. Before Dad died, he was already asking questions about this place, about mineral rights. Otis lowered himself onto the step beside me with a small groan, his old joints protesting the morning cold. That doesn't surprise me as much as it probably surprises you. Why not? Because about a year before your father passed, I caught a man out near the north field with surveying equipment. Told me he was doing county work, checking property lines. I didn't believe him for a second. County surveyors don't drive Cadillacs and wear watches that cost more than my truck. I told your father about it. He got quiet in that way he did, when something worried him bad. And a week later, he had that fence line reinforced and put up trail cameras I don't think you found yet. Trail cameras, I repeated. Where? Otis pointed toward the tree line, toward a cluster of old oaks near the well house. There's a memory card in the barn, in the safe, that I know for a fact your daddy never got around to checking before he died. He asked me to keep collecting them monthly, swap them out, keep everything stored. Last one's from about 3 weeks before he passed. My heart was pounding as we walked out to the barn together. I retrieved the memory card from a small pouch tucked in the back corner of the safe I hadn't noticed the day before. And Otis, of all people, produced an old laptop from his truck that he swore still worked good enough. It took almost 20 minutes for the ancient machine to boot up, load the files, and let us scroll through months of grainy, motion-triggered footage. Deer, a family of raccoons, a red-tailed hawk landing on a fence post, hours and hours of nothing, and then, dated 6 weeks before my father's death, a clip that made both of us go completely silent. A man in a gray suit, standing at the edge of the tree line, clearly not expecting to be photographed, looking at something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, maybe a map, before looking up directly toward the camera, almost like he sensed it was there and walking away. That's him, Otis said quietly. That's Vance Sterling. You're sure? I've seen his face in the county paper enough times to know it anywhere. Sterling Resources bought half the mineral rights in this county over the past decade. Man's not shy about being photographed when he's winning. He's careful when he's not sure yet. I stared at the frozen image on the screen, at this stranger who had apparently been walking my father's land, measuring it, studying it, circling it like a predator waiting for the right moment. And a cold, sick feeling settled into my stomach as a new thought took shape. Otis, I said slowly, my father died of a heart attack. Sudden at night, alone in his study. Is there any chance? Otis was already shaking his head before I finished the sentence, but there was something careful in the way he did it. Something that told me he'd already had this thought himself and hadn't let himself finish it either. I don't know, son, he said quietly. I truly don't know. Your father had a bad heart. Everybody knew that. He'd had 2 scares before this one. But I won't lie to you and tell you the timing doesn't sit strange with me, too. I didn't sleep at all that 3rd night at the farmhouse. I lay in that dusty upstairs bedroom staring at the ceiling, turning over every possibility in my mind. Until somewhere around 4 in the morning, I made a decision that I knew, even as I was making it, would change the rest of my life. I wasn't going to sell the farm. I wasn't going to hide from what my father had left me, and I wasn't going to let Richard or Vance Sterling or anyone else take it from me through pressure or manipulation or worse. But I also wasn't going to walk into this blind. My father had spent 30 years being careful, and if I wanted to protect what he'd protected, I needed to be just as careful and just as smart, and I needed proof, real, undeniable proof, of exactly what Richard knew and exactly what he and Sterling were planning. The next morning, I called Daniel. Out of my 2 brothers, Daniel had always been the softer one, the one who laughed a beat too late at Richard's jokes, the one whose eyes sometimes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I'd always suspected that underneath the charm and the expensive watches, Daniel carried more guilt than he knew what to do with, and I decided to bet on that suspicion. Hey, he said when he picked up, sounding surprised. Everything okay out there? I need to ask you something, Daniel, and I need you to tell me the truth. A pause. Okay. Did you know before Dad died that this farm might be worth something? Not the $200,000 you and Richard offered me. I mean, actually worth something. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. Daniel? I don't know anything for certain, he finally said, and his voice had lost all its usual polish. Richard's been weird about that farm for almost a year, Michael. Started asking me strange questions. Meeting with people I didn't recognize. Mentioning some guy named Sterling a few times like it was supposed to mean something to me. I asked him about it once, and he told me to mind my own business, which, that's not like him. With me. We don't usually keep things from each other. Did he say anything about how Dad died? What kind of question is that? Daniel's voice sharpened, defensive, but underneath it I could hear fear starting to creep in. Dad had a heart attack, Michael. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything yet, I told him carefully. I just need you to think back. Anything strange? In the weeks before he died? Anything at all? Another long pause. There was one thing, Daniel finally said, quiet now. About 10 days before Dad died, Richard told me he had a big opportunity coming together, something that was going to change everything for the company. He seemed really wound up about it. I asked him what it was, and he said he'd tell me once it was finalized. I never thought about it again until right now. I closed my eyes, my hand tightening around the phone. Daniel, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me on this, even though I can't explain everything yet. Michael, you're scaring me. I know, I said. I'm a little scared too. But I need you to come out to the farm, alone, without telling Richard. I have something to show you, and I think, once you see it, you're going to understand why I'm asking. Daniel arrived at the farm 2 days later, driving alone, looking like a man who hadn't slept much better than I had. I met him on the porch, and before I let him inside, I looked him directly in the eyes. "What I'm about to show you," I said, "could change how you see our whole family. I need to know I can trust you with it." "Michael, you're my brother," Daniel said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something real underneath his voice, something that wasn't performance. "Whatever's going on, I want to know the truth. I'm tired of not knowing things." I told him almost everything, sitting at that same kitchen table where I'd read our father's letters. I showed him the geological report. I showed him the trail camera footage of Vance Sterling walking the tree line. I told him what Mr. Alderman had said about Richard's questions 8 months before Dad's death. Daniel's face went through a slow, terrible transformation as he listened. Disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked almost like grief, and finally, something harder, something that looked a lot like anger. "He knew," Daniel said quietly, staring at the folder on the table. "This whole time he's been offering to buy this place off you for $200,000. And he knew it was worth, Michael, how much are we talking about, actually?" "I don't know for certain yet," I admitted. "But based on current market prices for lithium and the size of the deposit in the survey, Daniel, we could be talking about a resource worth tens of millions of dollars, maybe more." Daniel put his head in his hands. "I offered to split that with him, half of 200,000. I actually thought I was being generous, giving you money for land I thought was worthless." He looked up at me and his eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I should have asked more questions. I should have known Richard was hiding something. I trusted him. He's my brother. He's supposed to look out for me too." "I need to know something," I said carefully. "And I need you to be completely honest, even if the answer scares you as much as it scares me. Do you think Richard could have had anything to do with Dad's death?" Daniel went very still. "Richard's ruthless in business," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he's not, Michael, he's not a murderer. I have to believe that. I have to." "I hope you're right," I said. "But I think we need to find out for certain. And I think the only way to do that is to let Richard believe he's still winning, for just a little while longer, while we figure out exactly what he and Sterling have been planning." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel and I worked together quietly, carefully, like two people diffusing something that could still go off in our hands. Daniel, still officially running the real estate side of the business, had access to records and communications that I never could have gotten on my own. He found emails between Richard and a shell company connected to Sterling Resources, dated 4 months before our father's death, discussing acquisition strategy for the Millbrook Hollow parcel contingent on change of ownership. Contingent on change of ownership. My father had to die, or at least sign the property away, before their plan could move forward. We also found something that made both of us feel sick. A life insurance policy Richard had taken out on our father 18 months before his death, structured through the company, larger than seemed reasonable for a man of his age and role. It wasn't proof of anything, not by itself. Rich businessmen took out policies like that sometimes for legitimate tax and succession reasons, but combined with everything else, it added one more heavy stone to a pile that was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. I also went back to Mr. Alderman, and this time I brought Daniel with me, and together we asked him to formally request my father's autopsy records and medical history from the county coroner's office. It took almost a week to come through, and when it did, Mr. Alderman called both of us into his office to deliver the results in person. "Your father's heart attack was consistent with his known cardiac history," Mr. Alderman said carefully, sliding the report across the desk. "There's no evidence of foul play, no unusual toxicology. I want to be very clear with both of you. By every medical measure available, this was a natural death. The relief that washed over Daniel was visible, his shoulders dropping, his breath leaving him in a long exhale. I felt some of the same relief, but underneath it, something else lingered. Not suspicion of murder anymore, but a colder, quieter anger at what I now understood clearly. Richard hadn't killed our father, but he had been circling him, planning around his death, calculating his own advantage while our father was still alive, and, as far as I could tell, entirely unaware of just how far his oldest son had already gone. He didn't need to kill him, I said quietly. Once Mr. Alderman had stepped out to give us a moment, he just needed to wait, and the second Dad was gone, he moved. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stared at the report on the desk, and I watched something in my brother break quietly, permanently, the last piece of blind trust he'd carried for Richard finally giving way. We decided the confrontation needed to happen on the farm itself. There was something important about that choice, something my father would have understood. That whatever came next needed to happen on the land itself, in the place where the truth had been buried and protected for 30 years. I called Richard and told him I'd reconsidered his offer, that I wanted to talk it through properly in person at the farm. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice even through the phone, the assumption that he'd finally worn me down. "Smart decision, Mikey," he said. "I'll bring the paperwork." He arrived on a warm Thursday afternoon, driving up the same gravel road, wearing another crisp shirt, carrying a leather folio under his arm like a man closing a deal he'd already mentally spent the profits from. What he didn't know was that Daniel's truck was already parked around the side of the barn out of sight, and that Otis was waiting inside the farmhouse with the folder, the letters, and the laptop with the trail camera footage already queued up. "Where's Daniel?" Richard asked, glancing around. "Thought he might want to be here for this." "He's already here," I said, and something in my voice made Richard's easy smile falter, just slightly. We walked into the farmhouse together, and when Richard saw Daniel sitting at the kitchen table and Otis standing quietly by the window, and the folder spread open in the middle of the table, with the geological report clearly visible on top, I watched every ounce of confidence drain slowly out of his face. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly careful. "Sit down, Richard," I said. "It's time we talked about what's really under this land, and about what you've known, and what you've been planning, since almost a year before Dad died." For a long moment, Richard didn't move. He stood in the doorway of that old farmhouse kitchen, looking at the three of us, and I watched him run through his options, the way I imagined he ran through business decisions every day of his life, fast, calculating, looking for the angle that would let him walk out of this with something intact. Finally, he sat down. "Fine," he said, his voice flat now, all the charm stripped away. "You want to talk? Let's talk." I laid it out for him piece by piece. The geological survey, the letter from our father, the trail camera footage of Vance Sterling walking the property, the emails Daniel had found between Richard and Sterling Resources, the life insurance policy, the questions Richard had asked Mr. Alderman 8 months before Dad's death. I watched Richard's face carefully the entire time, looking for denial, for anger, for anything. And what I saw instead was something that surprised me. A kind of exhausted resignation, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long alone. "You have no idea what it's like," Richard finally said, his voice tight. "Being the oldest son of Walter Carter. Every decision I ever made, he compared to what he would have done. Every deal I closed, he found something wrong with it. And then, 18 months ago, I found an old survey report in his study. I wasn't snooping, Michael, I swear to God. I was looking for a contract and I found it by accident. And I finally understood. Everything he built, everything, he made me chase my whole life. It was never really his genius. It was this. He gestured around the kitchen, at the farmhouse, at the land beyond the walls. He got lucky, and then he spent 30 years pretending it was hard work and vision. And he was going to let it all just sit here, rotting, instead of using it to actually build something. So you decided to steal it? Daniel said quietly. And there was real hurt in his voice. From your own family. From me. I wasn't stealing anything, Richard snapped. I was going to develop it properly, bring in real investment. Sterling's company has the expertise to extract that deposit safely, responsibly, and turn it into something that actually matters, instead of sitting here as some kind of shrine to Dad's guilty conscience. And what happens to Millbrook Hollow? I asked. To the water table? To Otis and the other families who've lived on this land for generations, once Sterling Resources moves in with heavy extraction equipment? Richard didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer for that, because I don't think, in all his calculating, he'd ever actually asked himself that question. You offered me $200,000, I said quietly, for land you knew was worth tens of millions. You were going to let me sign that away, thinking I was getting a fair deal while you and Sterling split whatever came after. It wasn't personal, Michael. Richard's voice cracked slightly, the first real crack I'd seen in him since he walked through the door. I needed this to work. The construction company is bleeding money, has been for 2 years. I've been covering it with loans against assets I don't fully own yet. If this deal with Sterling doesn't happen, I lose everything. Not just the opportunity, everything. The room went quiet, and in that silence I understood something about my brother that I hadn't understood before. That underneath the expensive suits and the easy confidence, Richard had been drowning for longer than any of us realized, and instead of asking for help, he decided to take what he thought he was owed. You should have come to me, I said finally. You should have come to Dad before he died and told him the company was struggling. He would have helped you, Richard. He loved you. Whatever else was true between you two, he loved you. Richard's eyes filled, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my oldest brother cry. I didn't want his help, Richard said, his voice breaking completely now. I wanted to prove I didn't need it. I wanted to prove I was better than the son who inherited a lucky hole in the ground and pretended it was hard work. That's exactly what you were trying to do to me, I said quietly. Take this land for pennies and pretend it was generosity. Richard didn't say anything to that. He just sat there, his shoulders shaking, and for a long time none of us spoke. It took another 3 weeks to fully untangle everything. Mr. Alderman helped us formalize the legal protections around the mineral rights, making absolutely certain the deed and the geological findings were airtight, registered, and protected under my name alone, exactly as our father had structured it. Daniel, working with a forensic accountant, uncovered the full scope of Richard's financial trouble. Carter Construction was, in fact, badly over-leveraged, months away from serious collapse if nothing changed. Vance Sterling, when he finally realized his inside connection had unraveled and that I now had documented proof of his years of covert surveying and his attempted arrangement with Richard, backed off quickly and quietly, the way men like that always do when the risk of exposure starts to outweigh the potential reward. Mr. Alderman sent him a formal cease and desist that echoed the ones my father had sent years before, and Sterling Resources never approached the property again. Richard, to his credit, didn't fight any of it once the truth was fully out in the open. I think some part of him was almost relieved to be caught, the way a man is relieved when a weight he's been dragging finally gets taken off his shoulders, even if the taking hurts. I made a decision in those weeks about what I wanted to do with what my father had left me. And it wasn't the decision Richard would have made, and it wasn't the decision I think anyone in that lawyer's office expected from the quiet school teacher who inherited a dead farm. I didn't sell the mineral rights to a company like Sterling Resources. Instead, working with Mr. Alderman and a small team of consultants, I hired specifically for their reputation in responsible, community-conscious resource development. I structured a partnership that allowed for careful, limited, environmentally monitored extraction. Enough to fund something meaningful, without stripping the land bare, without poisoning Otis's well water, without turning Millbrook Hollow into a company town owned by strangers. I used part of the proceeds to establish a trust for the town itself, funding for the school, for the volunteer fire department that had been running on donated equipment for a decade, for a scholarship program for kids in Millbrook Hollow who wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it. The way I imagine my father deep down might have wanted to do himself if he'd ever found the courage to stop hiding and start building something openly instead of in secret. I gave Otis Greer a piece of the land outright, formally, legally, the acreage where his family had lived and worked for 3 generations before my father ever bought the property. He cried when I told him, this tough, weathered old man who'd kept a 30-year secret without ever once asking what was in it for him. Your daddy would be proud of you, Otis said, gripping my hand hard. I know that's not much comfort considering he's not here to say it himself. But I knew him 35 years, and I'm telling you, Michael, this is exactly what he was hoping you'd do. And Richard, I didn't cut him off completely, though. There were people around me, even Rachel, who thought I probably should have. Instead, I offered him something he didn't expect. A stake in the new venture, small, tied directly to actual work, actual accountability, actual honesty going forward. Not a handout. A chance to rebuild something real, under conditions that would keep him from ever again mistaking desperation for permission to take what wasn't his. Why, he asked me, the day I offered it. Sitting across from me at that same kitchen table where he'd once tried to buy this land out from under me for $200,000. After everything I did. Why would you do this for me? Because Dad spent 30 years protecting something valuable by keeping it buried, I told him. And I think that cost him something. I think it cost him you, in a way. Cost him the chance to ever really know if you loved him or just needed him. I don't want to make that same mistake. I'd rather take the risk of trusting you again than spend the rest of my life the way he did, guarding something so carefully that I lose the people it was supposed to be for. Richard didn't say anything for a long moment, and then, quietly, he said, I'm sorry, Michael, for all of it. The mocking, at the will reading, the offer, all of it. I know, I said. Just don't make me regret this. The following spring, almost a year after my father's death, I stood at his grave with Rachel beside me, our daughter running through the grass a little ways off, and I read his letter out loud one more time, quietly, just for myself, just for him. The farm looked different now. The farmhouse had a fresh coat of paint. The barn stood straight again, repaired boards, replacing the leaning ones. There was a small building going up near the north field, modest, careful, monitored, exactly the kind of operation my father had spent 30 years dreaming of, but never found the courage to build in the open. And in town, there was a new sign outside the elementary school, funded by the Walter Carter Memorial Trust, and a scholarship fund with 11 kids from Millbrook Hollow, now enrolled in colleges they never could have afforded on their own, and a volunteer fire department with a new truck that actually started every single time. I thought about that day in the lawyer's office. Richard laughing, calling my inheritance a joke, calling me the son who got nothing while they got everything. He was wrong that day, but not in the way any of us understood at the time. I hadn't gotten nothing. I'd gotten the one thing my father trusted no one else in the family to carry: the truth and the choice of what to do with it. Not the money, not the businesses, the choice. My father spent his whole life believing that some things had to be hidden to be protected, that the ground had to stay quiet, that secrets kept people safe. I understood standing there at his grave with the wind moving through the grass exactly the way it must have moved through it the day he first found something extraordinary buried beneath an ordinary field, that he'd been wrong about that, at least a little. Some things don't stay safe by staying hidden. They stay safe because, eventually, someone finds the courage to bring them into the light and handle them honestly. "I did what you asked, Dad," I said quietly, kneeling to set a small bundle of wildflowers against his headstone. "I went to the farm. I found what you buried. And I hope I did right by it. By all of it." Behind me, I heard footsteps on the grass, and I turned to see Daniel walking up, and a few steps behind him, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain in a way I'd never once seen him look before in his entire life. Richard. The three of us stood there together at our father's grave. Three brothers who'd spent our whole lives believing we understood exactly where we each stood in the family, only to learn in the end that the truth had been sitting quietly underground the whole time, waiting for the right person to have the patience and the humility and the heart to dig it up. My father used to say that the ground never lies, that if you're patient enough and honest enough, it will always eventually tell you exactly what's really there. I believe that now, the way I never quite believed it before. Because underneath everything my brothers mocked me for, the small inheritance, the quiet life, the farm nobody wanted, there was something my father knew about me long before I ever knew it about myself. He knew that some of us aren't given riches so we can keep them. Some of us are given them so we can finally learn what to do with the truth, once we're brave enough to dig deep enough to find it. And I finally understood, standing there with my brothers in the quiet spring sunlight, that my father hadn't left me the least valuable thing he owned. He'd left me the only thing that ever really mattered.